Welcome everyone. We're at the top of the hour, so we'll go ahead and get started with our webinar today. My name is Melanie Ross, and I will be the facilitator of our webinar. Our presenter is Deanne Emory, and we also have Brad Putnam here as well. Thank you for joining ANAB for our complimentary webinar on internal auditing practices for forensic service providers. Please note, we are recording the webinar, so it will be available for viewing in the future. Some logistics before we get started. Due to the high attendance today, everyone will remain muted for the duration of the webinar. If you have any questions, you can submit those questions into the Q&A box. We do have time planned at the end of the webinar to answer those questions asked. We do provide this disclaimer at the beginning of each webinar. The content that's delivered today is not guaranteed to fully prepare you for any specific application for accreditation. Attendees are responsible for determining the applicability of the information presented to their specific circumstances. The examples provided in the webinar are for illustrative purposes only and are intended to facilitate understanding of the concepts discussed. They are not to be interpreted as templates, prescriptive models, or representations of compliance with any specific standard. A little bit about our presenter before we get going. Deanne Emory is ANAB's instructional designer. She develops and instructs training courses and assists with training of our contract instructors. She has over 30 years of experience in quality assurance and quality management in both laboratories and manufacturing. I also mentioned Brad Putnam earlier. He is the Senior Director of Accreditation for our Forensics business unit, and he's here to assist in answering your questions at the end of the webinar. With that, I am going to turn it over to Deanne to present the topic.
Thank you so much, Melanie. During the next hour, we're going to talk about the requirements of internal audits from both ISO 17025 and the ANAB AR 3125 document, which is entitled Accreditation Requirements for Forensic Testing and Calibration Laboratories. We're going to also discuss ways to efficiently and effectively add direct observation, also known as witnessing, to your organization's internal audit program, and how to develop audit plans based on risk, taking into account the laboratory's scope, size, and needs. So let's dive into the internal auditing requirements. ISO 17025 in clause 8.8.1 states that the laboratory shall conduct internal audits at planned intervals to provide information on whether the management system conforms to the laboratory's own requirements for its management system, including the laboratory's activities and the requirements of ISO 17025. ANAB AR 3125 adds that internal audits shall provide information on whether the management system also meets the requirements of AR 3125. ISO 17025 goes on to say the laboratory shall conduct internal audits at planned intervals to provide information on whether the management system is effectively implemented and maintained. So ISO 17025 states that internal audits need to be conducted over planned intervals. However, ANAB AR 3125 states in the clause 8.8.1.1 that internal audits shall be conducted at least annually and shall also be done prior to your first assessment. So what does this mean? In other words, it means that at least annually and prior to the laboratory's initial accreditation assessment, the laboratory needs to audit the accessible requirements in both ISO 17025 and AR 3125 to make sure the management system is effectively implemented and effectively maintained. The auditable requirements are clauses 4 through 8 in both documents. In addition, the laboratory has to audit its own requirements in the same way. So examples of that would be quality manuals, policies, procedures, methods, and practices. So let's move into the rest of the requirements. ISO 17025, Clause 8.8.2a states that the laboratory shall plan, establish, implement, and maintain an audit program, including the frequency, methods, responsibilities, planning requirements, and reporting, which shall take into consideration the importance of the laboratory activities concerned, changes affecting the laboratory, and results of previous audits. Each word between commas is a requirement that is included in the laboratory shall. So the laboratory shall plan, comma, establish, comma, implement, and maintain. Here are 4 requirements for an audit program. This shall include the frequency, comma, methods, comma, etc. Read this section very carefully when creating or revising your audit program. Let's go back to the rest of the requirements in 8.8.2. Clause B states the laboratory shall define audit criteria and the audit scope for each audit. C says the laboratory shall ensure that the results of audits are reported to relevant management. Who relevant management is decided by the laboratory. Moving on, we shall implement appropriate correction and corrective actions without undue delay. And finally, the requirement to retain our records as evidence of the implementation of the audit program and the audit results. We're not going to spend a lot of time on setting audit objectives, criteria, scopes, or reporting on audits. In May of 2025, we gave a free webinar entitled Using Internal Audits for Process Improvement. That webinar, which is on our website, covered how to meet the requirements of Clause 8.8.2 and, of course, how to use your internal audits for process improvement. You may find it helpful to watch in conjunction with this webinar that we are working with today. So let's look at one more added requirement of AR 3125. Clause 8.8.2.b.1 of AR 3125 states that internal audits shall include direct observation of a portion of accredited activities within each discipline. So what does this added requirement mean? Let's break it down. What are the lab's accredited activities? Well, they are the disciplines, methods, components, and parameters found on your scope of accreditation, or if you are seeking accreditation, on your draft scope of accreditation. So what is direct observation? It is a method of internal or external auditing or assessing, such as our assessments, that includes intentionally watching a test, calibration, sampling, or inspection activity of a component or parameter listed in a discipline, which will be found on the laboratory scope of accreditation or draft scope of accreditation. It is just as important to know what direct observation or witnessing is not. It is not our general observations. General observations, such as walking through areas where work is being performed, are also essential to good internal audit practice. But they are not the direct observation that we're talking about. Examples would include observing analysts enter and exit secure areas of a lab to verify that they're meeting the requirements of their own procedure on security, or maybe observing evidence or property being received and how it is handled and stored. So it is very important that we know the difference between direct observation, which we tend to call witnessing, and our general observations during an audit. So how do we put this all together? We have our management system. We have to do witnessing. We have all of our standard requirements that must be met. We need to do this under planned intervals, which means we have to do planning. And of course, AR 3125 states that this has to be done at least annually. We have to define our objectives before we start our audits. Again, talking about planning. And our audit program needs to be effectively implemented. How does all of this work together? The answer is risk-based thinking. So why? Why do we want to use risk-based thinking? One of the best ways that I've seen it described was in a white paper published by ISO when ISO 9001-2015 was published. It said risk-based thinking needs to be considered from the beginning and throughout the system, making preventive action inherent to planning, operation, analysis, and evaluation activities. Here, ISO is discussing preventive action. Risk-based thinking is a proactive rather than reactive process to prevent or reduce undesired effects through early identification and action. So what are undesired effects? Well, examples would be nonconformances, customer complaints, poor implementation of a management system, out of control processes. These are all undesired effects within our laboratory. All ISO standards are shifting to, or like ISO 17025 have shifted to, risk-based thinking. They are less prescriptive in general and allow organizations to create management systems that work for them. Risk-based thinking gives us the ability to focus on preventing or reducing these undesired effects. It increases the likelihood that we will meet our objectives, and it helps create more consistent output of the organization, and in our cases here, of our laboratory. It is a more global approach of identifying risks, considering them, and controlling them before they become issues. When we are considering risks within our own audit program, here are some of the points you might consider. Of course, this list is not all-inclusive, and it's written here as examples for consideration to start opening your mind if this is a new topic to you. So, what is the frequency of your non-conforming work? Either in each discipline, or within each clause of the standards, or within sections of your management system. What are the findings that you're seeing in your previous audits? Review your customer complaints. Do you see trends? What is the frequency of performing a process, an activity, or a function? Do you only perform a specific process once or twice a year, where analysts may need to review the processes? Or, on the other side, are there processes that are performed many times each week that may become monotonous, perhaps to the point of cutting corners? What are the number of personnel, and do you have high turnovers? Have there been changes to the volume or type of work that you're doing, changes to technology or introduction of new technology? And what are other maybe internal or external issues that are being discussed perhaps in management review? So before moving into how we can make risk-based approach to scheduling audits work for us, let's discuss a little bit about the internal audit process itself. Specifically, I want to talk about the four types of audits: management system versus technical audits, and horizontal versus vertical audits. Management system audits evaluate the system's conformance to the requirements of whatever standards you're working with. In this case, we're looking at ISO 17025 and the current version of AR 3125. Your management system may also include other requirements, such as regulatory requirements that need to be audited. Technical operations audit is a thorough verification of process. Here is where you are looking at your laboratory controls. For example, ensuring the validity of results, and maybe where applicable, your measurement uncertainty and metrological traceability. Here's where you are going to interview and observe your analysts. This is also where you will be doing your witnessing. A horizontal audit is looking at one process across many departments, many functions. This type of audit might follow a process from start to finish. Vertical audits are looking at all processes and activities within a single department or function. It looks up and down within that department or function. Both horizontal and vertical audits are valuable, as are both management system and technical operations audit. When planning your internal audits, it is good practice to consider all four of these types within your audit program and use them when they are each applicable. Let's put a scenario together and see how this could all work together. So here we have an accredited forensic service provider with a team of internal auditors. The auditors are all trained to audit ISO 17025 and AR 3125 and are familiar and active in auditing all auditable clauses of the documents. Each auditor has expertise in their own disciplines, and the audit program allows for the use of an expert from a discipline if an auditor needs to go to audit outside of their own discipline. For example, in a horizontal audit or in a technical operations audit where they do not have competence. This is important to make sure someone competent is always available for witnessing and technical operations. The expert may or may not be a trained internal auditor. The technical expert that you bring there is there to advise the person or people who are assigned to the audit. This laboratory does monthly audits and in 1 year covers all auditable elements of ISO 17025 and AR 3125. They use this scheduling plan. And this type of schedule allows them to add follow-up audits when nonconformances are found and allows for areas of higher risk to be audited more than once during the annual cycle. All of this would be decided during risk assessments or risk analysis and can be changed as our risk levels might change during the course of the year. So, how might we add witnessing to meet the requirements for direct observation? Well, let's go back to our example scenario and see what type of witnessing needs to be done. The laboratory has 4 disciplines on its scope of accreditation. Discipline A has 1 component parameter, 3 pieces of equipment or technology, and 1 method that the analysts use. Discipline B has 2 components or parameters, 10 pieces of equipment, technology, and 6 methods. Discipline C has 3 components, parameters, 8 pieces of equipment, and the lab has 8 methods. And finally, Discipline D has 2 components or parameters, 1 piece of equipment or technology, and 2 methods. One method of considering witnessing planning could be a planning matrix, and that's what we're going to use in our example here. So this sample planning matrix, after doing a risk analysis within each discipline, would be filled out for each discipline. The laboratory, in this case, has decided that in addition to their regular management schedule, they're going to add this matrix. And in discussion and in their analysis decided that they would cover all items on their scope within the 4-year accreditation cycle. Since they do monthly internal audits, if they evenly distribute the opportunities for each discipline, there would be 3 scheduled opportunities each year to go into each discipline. Of course, depending on the findings and added information over the accreditation cycle, this matrix can be changed and updated. So let's look at how this might be filled out by the laboratory. Discipline A is new to the scope, so the laboratory, in its analysis, gave it a higher risk number and made the decision to audit each of the 2 analysts the first year, and then plans on auditing 1 analyst years 2 and 4. The notes kept on analysts and technology are on a separate note page because they are going to pick different analysts, and if they have duplicate technology, different pieces of equipment each time they do their audits. Discipline B has 6 methods and quite a number of analysts. It has 2 components and parameters and 10 pieces of equipment technology, all covered within the 6 methods. So during risk analysis, there was a review of the records, which showed that they had a customer complaint that was valid and involved method B6. Therefore, they choose to audit B6 more often to make sure complaints do not recur. Discipline C is the largest discipline with the most analysts and methods, but records showed during risk analysis that there were no real issues. If issues are found and the risk assessment needs updating, this matrix will also be updated as needed, but for the first risk analysis, the laboratory has spread all 8 methods over their witnessing plan cycle. Finally, Discipline D has a new analyst. So for this cycle, the lab has chosen to make sure the discipline was observed each year by alternating the 2 methods. Notes state that they are to start with the new analyst. So you can see here, by creating this matrix, the laboratory has annually taken a sampling from each discipline. They've also created a plan that can be changed and updated as their risks may change, or as their risk analyses may change. We've added an other row here for special planning. For example, perhaps in year 2, the laboratory may prepare to have a scope extension, a new discipline to their scope. Here they can add that to their witnessing planning matrix because they need to do this and have it shown that they have done it before they would have their first assessment in their new discipline. Here we see that the laboratory has now added the 4 disciplines to their audit plan schedule. Note, for 2026, Discipline A is in the first quarter, B is in the second, etc. A good practice could be for planning in 2027, perhaps beginning with Discipline B and then second quarter Discipline C, and changing it each year of the cycle so that each discipline is audited at different times of the year. Might that make a difference? It depends on the risk analysis that you do with your laboratory. How might we make this more efficient and effective? Well, let's talk a little bit about audit objectives and audit scopes before we go back to our example scenario and talk more about doing this efficiently and effectively. Audit objectives define what needs to be accomplished for both our overall audit program and for each individual audit. And these audit objectives need to be planned. The goal is to ensure the laboratory's management system complies, in this case, with ISO 17025 and the AR 3125 document. When defining audit objectives, I feel it is best practice to use SMART goals. This will provide a clear framework for your audit program. So SMART is specific. The goals are clearly stated, measurable. We're always going to predefine what success looks like. Achievable. Are the objectives reasonably accomplishable? Relevant. Are the individual audit objectives aligned with the audit program objectives? And then finally, timely. Knowing time constraints will help clarify task prioritization. The scope of each audit needs to be consistent with the audit program and the outlined audit objectives. The scope should include the location or locations within the laboratory or within the laboratories that you are associated with, the functions, the activities, the processes, and the time period covered. But before we move on, I want to talk about scheduling and activities. Direct observation or witnessing is not a new requirement of AR 3125, but it might be relatively new to your own audit program. Be aware that it is a requirement, and during assessments, the assessor will look at your audit records. Be sure that in addition to all of the clauses 4 through 8 of ISO 17025 and AR 3125 being audited annually, that you accomplish the witnessing activities that you are scheduled for, and that you do schedule and plan them. The witnessing of a specific test or calibration does not need to take place within a scheduled management system audit if that's not going to work for a specific audit. It can take place prior to or after the scheduled audit if necessary. For example, the analyst who needs to be witnessed takes PTO on that day, and the audit can't go forward without that analyst. You can't do the witnessing. Well, if that PTO was pre-scheduled, if it's vacation time, well, you can do it earlier. If the person is out sick, you can do it later. But whatever you choose to do, you need to reschedule. You need to reschedule when necessary. Do not skip a witnessing or an audit in a discipline because of scheduling conflicts. You need to reschedule if necessary, because you do have to do that entire management system audit once a year and a portion of credited activities. It is a requirement. So, do we keep management audits separate from technical witnessing audits, or could they be combined? I want to leave you with a thought, something to think about when you are adding the witnessing to your audit program, or how maybe to more efficiently work with the witnessing and management system audits. Let's say you were assigned an audit in clause 6 of ISO 17025 and AR 3125. So that's the resource requirements. And you are also assigned to witness method B6 of discipline B. And you are competent to witness the method. It is perfectly acceptable to keep your management audit separate from your technical or witnessing audit. You can do it at 2 separate times. But could they be combined? Well, let's talk about the best practice when we are thinking about doing witnessing within our audits. The best practice is always to do your witnessing early, because it does take time and there's always scheduling to be done, and we have to consider time management. So let's say in this case that we've already witnessed method B6. You have seen it, you've taken your notes. How could you combine some of your other tasks before leaving this analyst or this area of the laboratory? Well, after witnessing, you can talk to the analyst about their training, and then afterwards check their training records. This would satisfy parts of 6.2 on personnel. Ask the analyst about environmental conditions, and then afterwards check any pertinent records for example, temperature, humidity, or barometric pressure. This will satisfy parts of Clause 6.3 on facilities and environmental conditions. Write down the equipment used and ask the analyst about handling and storage or maintenance, and then look at the records. Look at the calibration program. This will satisfy parts of Clause 6.4 on equipment. For any calibrated equipment, look at the report of calibration or certificate, looking for the metrological traceability, satisfying parts of Clause 6.5 on metrological traceability. For the equipment you've written down, now look at the purchasing records, receiving records, and any verifications before the equipment was put into service. Here, you will again satisfy more of parts 6.4 on equipment and part 6.6 on externally provided products and services. When you go back to your notes and you start working with your checklist, if you haven't while you're working it, there may still be blanks. There may still be places you need to work, but you will have collected a good amount of objective evidence within Clause 6 and accomplished the witnessing activity you are required to accomplish. So, in conclusion, an effective internal audit program is one based on risk. It will help drive improvement within your laboratory, and when effectively implemented, may assist in finding problems or undesired effects before they become non-conformances, customer complaints, or external assessment findings. Before I turn this back to Melanie, I did discuss with you early on that we had a webinar on internal audits for process improvement on May 15th. I also want to point you in the direction of one that we did in January on general method witnessing for internal audits. Both of these might be helpful to you in conjunction with this webinar. You can find them at the link above, or you can go to our homepage at anab.org and you'll be able to find them through links there. I'll turn the webinar back to you now, Melanie.
Thank you, Deanne. Excellent question, or excellent information, excuse me. Before we get into your questions, I do want to go over some additional resources that ANAB has for accredited and non-accredited organizations. This will give you some time to put your questions into that Q&A box as well. ANAB has many different media to further your understanding of standards, accreditation, management systems, and assessments. On our website, we have a few free webcasts on a variety of topics. These are about 5 to 20 minutes long, depending on the topic, and they can be viewed at any time. We also have a blog page that has a lot of information related to risk, like the topic today, accreditation standard requirements, and others. We also give these webinars monthly, like Deanne said. The webinars that we provide are recorded and put on our website, but we also have future webinars planned, such as What is Metrology next month with one of our accreditation managers from our laboratory business unit. We offer training in a variety of different topics as well. We have in-person courses, but the majority of our courses are live online. We offer training in all the different topics that I've already discussed, and we also have self-paced training, and all of that can be found on our website. All of these resources as well can be found on the ANAB website at anab.ansi.org. Now we'll get on to your questions. We had one question come into the inbox. What are your thoughts on witnessing in a non-technical capacity?
I think that's me. So hopefully my microphone's working. Personally, right, I want to point out a couple of things. Requirements are a baseline, a minimum to be achieved. So witnessing in a technical capacity is the requirement. Witnessing is a valuable assessment activity. Internal audits, as as well as assessment activity. Watching any task being performed can gather a great deal of information. So I think witnessing a non-technical, such as evidence transfer, evidence login, instrument maintenance, is a very valuable tool.
Excellent, great. We have a different question here. Do we have to use a witnessing plan matrix like the one that was presented in this webinar today?
No, the templates were illustrative purposes, so none of those are required. They are certainly thought-provoking and an excellent record to ensure that you are moving your observations or witnessings around and hitting all the risky areas of the assessment, but they are not required.
We had a clarification for that first question. It says, I mean, non-technical in the sense of having someone with experience in a different discipline do the witnessing in a discipline other than their own.
Ah, okay. That is a little refinement. That starts getting, how do I say, less effective. From a complete method review, it's valuable in the fact that the method says step 1, 2, and 3. And if you are disassociated from that method, and you may notice that they went right step 1 to step 3, and they always skip step 2. And somebody that's close and technically proficient may understand why they're skipping step 2. So you may get information from that perspective, but I don't think that outweighs the benefit of having somebody with technical expertise watch the subtle nuances where contamination may occur or a volume is incorrect. That is really critical to that particular method. So I personally don't see much value in non-technical individuals witnessing. If they were technically competent in the past, that's fine. So they don't have to be on your proficiency testing schedule. But to have a DNA analyst watch seize drugs or vice versa, I start seeing little value in that.
Excellent. The next question is, what would be the best way and necessary way that an auditor documents the witnessing to maintain for documentation for the internal audit?
Well, as long as it's a written record that can be reviewed is sufficient, right? That minimum there to improve consistency. I've seen many of our clients develop witnessing worksheets. So the witnessing is standardized from section to section to section, but certainly any of those work records are not required.
We have a little bit different question here that's actually not related to the topic of the webinar today. So I'll ask the question, and then if we want to defer to provide an answer outside the webinar, that's fine. With the redefinition of some SI units in 2019 based on fundamental constants, is it still valid to reference the international prototype of the kilogram in calibration certificates for metrological traceability?
Yeah, I'm going to defer to that on a number of reasons. Number one, my metrological knowledge. So if you could send that question to our quality matters at anab.org, I would prefer getting that assigned to a metrologist expert.
Excellent. How to select internal auditors and what kind of training do they need to have?
Yeah, so obviously I am a huge fan of training and knowledge. So the more expertise they have in internal auditing principles and practices is always encouraged. 17025 in the 2017 version did remove the requirement for it, right, an internal audit training. So there's no specific requirements for internal auditors anymore. But the more familiar they are with your management system, the requirements, the obviously witnessing and the technical expertise, the more, the bigger benefit you are going to have from your internal audit.
Okay, then would you suggest or require all methods be scheduled to be observed within an accreditation cycle, even if a given method is low risk?
No, I would say, right, that it's based on a risk matrix. But then keep in mind, right, the results of previous audits. Have you never audited that particular method? I understand low risk, and you could go 4 years without necessarily witnessing that. But is it so low and unchanging that 8 years is practicable? So I'd ask you to, right, look at the bigger picture than required in a given cycle.
Great. The next question is about ANAB's accreditation capabilities. So I will take note of that question and reach out to that person outside of this webinar. And then the next question says, our lab only has 3 people. Would we all be internal auditors?
You could be, right? And that would obviously be the best practice. But if, right, somebody didn't want to be an internal auditor, you wouldn't have to. But in my opinion, again, right, the more knowledgeable your staff is regarding the requirements, internal auditing, et cetera, I think the smoother your management system is going to run.
All right. Then someone is asking if the checklist for planning from slide 30 something, is it available for download?
I can't answer that.
Yeah.
I don't know the tools that are available for download.
So we don't provide templates out to our accredited clients because it is up to the accredited client to determine what works best for them. The recording of this webinar will be available after the fact. So if you want to create something on your own that looks similar to that, you are more than welcome to do so. But again, like Brad said, it's not required like the matrix. You can use whatever your laboratory determines is best for documenting your internal audits. And then a comment to please include 17020 in your marketing and presentations. These same principles apply. Absolutely, they do. Give me 1 second. And then I have one more question that came in privately is, what I'm hearing is witnessing is mandatory or a shall. Will we get a nonconformity in our assessment if we don't do witnessing?
Yes. Short answer. Yeah. Any non-meeting of a requirement is considered non-conforming.
Very well put. Very well put. Let's see. All right, that is the end of our questions here. Oh, wait, one more just came in. 2 more. It's asking for examples of acceptable evidence against requirement of monitoring the ongoing risk to impartiality.
Yeah, so, right, objective evidence that you are actually evaluating the risk of impartiality. What we generally see is information in your management review. But right, many clients are moving to a worksheet when new staff are hired, right? So you have to evaluate your risk of impartiality to certain things, right? And it's ongoing. So many folks have incorporated that particular risk when new staff come on, right? What are the relationships to that staff when they add any scope extensions, right? New capabilities, et cetera. All those activities that need to be evaluated against impartiality as they're brought on. The expectation is that, right, we evaluate that implication to the risk of our management system and create some record of that evaluation. My guess is, right, your evaluation of a new staff member and the risk that they may bring is different than the risk to a scope extension and the risks that that may bring. So, right, one universal worksheet might not be applicable, but the same worksheet or a different worksheet for the same activity. Right? Each new employee, you answer these questions and you evaluate these situations. Each scope extension, you look at these particular things. And then obviously maintaining that record would be sufficient evidence of ongoing monitoring to risk to impartiality.
Very interesting. We have one more question in our list of Q&A. Is there a requirement to be trained by ANAB to serve as a contracted internal auditor to ISO 17020? Can internal audits completed by external contractors satisfy the annual internal audit requirement? That's two questions there.
Yep, two questions. I think I can answer both. So there is no requirement from ANAB. So as organizations, right, hire external suppliers, services and supplies, right, so that external servicer, they may have requirements that they would like to see in the external service provider. Their particular requirements may mandate, right, an internal audit course. They may specify that this course needs to be taken by ANAB, but that's not a requirement from ANAB. That would be of the client's request of the vendor. So that answer is no. And then the second answer is yes, a internal audit may be completed by an external individual or service provider.
Okay, great. I don't have any other questions in our Q&A box, so I will leave you all with additional contact information for ANAB. If you have any questions about our training offerings, you can email training@anab.org or for accreditations at anab@anab.org. And as well, Brad mentioned the Quality Matters at anab.org. That goes directly to our forensics business unit. I want to thank Deanne for presenting today and Brad for answering your questions here at the end. If you do have any additional questions, you can email any of those email addresses that I mentioned and present your questions. Thank you all for attending today. And with that, we will end the webinar.